This is Nick Radcliffe from Stochastic Solutions, and this morning I'm going to show you how you can use the reference testing capability in the TDDA library to gain some extra power over what you can normally do with pytest, particularly in the case where what you're generating is complex outputs that would be quite hard to generate by hand. So let's get started. I'm going to assume that you already have the TDDA library installed and that you are somewhere you're happy to write some files. And then I'm going to run the TDDA examples command, which will copy into place various files. And we're going to be working on the reference testing component, and in particular the pytest version of the exercises, and in particular exercise 1. And if we go into there, we'll see we've got 4 files. Now, this exercise is all based on the idea of generating a static web page, which we've got here, expected.html. Generators.py contains the code to generate that. And test all is a pytest test of that code. We've also got conftest.py, which just extends pytest slightly for this. That's boilerplate code that we always need, and I'll show you that later. So let's just look at the web page that we are generating. It is just a lump of text with an image in it. That image is a vector image, an SVG image, so the whole thing's just generated by generators.py, and well, it's generated in memory. And if we look at our test code just has some imports and a single test function. So the thing that we import from generators is this generate string function, which generates the contents of the web page. And then our test simply calls that and assigns it to this actual variable. Then reads in our expected content into the expected variable and asserts that they're the same. So nothing at all complicated. So if we run pytest on this, we will see that we get a failure. And pytest does a pretty good job actually of indicating what the failure is. You can see that there are at least 2. There's a Solutions 2016 that's become a Solutions Limited 2016, or in fact that's no longer a Limited 2016. And there's a version 1.0.0 against a version 0.0.0. But there is other stuff as well, and we can see that by saying pytest -vv. But we get a little bit overwhelmed if we do that. So, pytest has done a good job of showing us what's going on, but not a perfect job. So what I want to do is upgrade this code to use the TDDA reference testing capability and see what advantages that gives us. So to do that, I need to go into that test file, which is here. And I really just need to make 2 changes. Well, 3 changes, I guess. The first is I need to change the assertion, and what I need to change it to is ref.assert string correct, actual expected. And you'll say, well, what's ref? Well, ref is a fixture. It's an object that conftest sets up for us. And what that does is just allow us to use these slightly fancier assertions that the TDDA library provides. And the third change is we're just going to give it the path to the file rather than reading it ourselves and change it to that. So if I run pytest again, having made those changes, we see that we still get the same failure, but what we now see is it tells us the expected file was expected.html, and that it gives us the diff command we can use to do the comparison. Obviously, pytest shows us that diff, but it truncates it. So we could just run that command, and we'll see exactly the diff, and it's the two things that it highlighted, and also that there's no new line at the end of the file. So fairly simple stuff. We can also, if we prefer, if we have a visual diff command like on the Mac, open diff, we can obviously run that, and that potentially helps us to see even more clearly exactly what the differences are. So that's quite nice, not a huge difference. And the third thing that it helps a little bit with is if we did conclude that the new output's correct, that all that's happened is we've changed the version number and the copyright notice, we probably want to check that the file actually looks the same as well, even though we've maybe convinced ourselves it should do. So we'll just look at this new one that's been generated. Oh, I should say, how did it manage to do that, diff? Well, when the test failed, pytest decided to squirrel away the copy of what it was testing. So remember, it had assigned the contents of the web page that had been generated to that actual variable, and it's written this out into a temporary directory, into a temporary file, precisely so that we can use it, look at it, and so forth. And if I open that, we can see that visually that certainly looks identical to what was happening before, which makes sense because what changed is just in the comments. I should have emphasized that's not text that gets printed on the page. So having convinced ourselves that, in fact, the new version is correct, one thing we might do is just copy that generated version into the new one, and then we'd expect that the tests would pass. And that would be a fine thing to do, but it's not what I'm going to do in this case, because if we stand back slightly, we'd probably realize that the version number is something that's going to change quite a lot. And if the only difference between our generated result and the expected one was the version number, we'd probably never care about that. And the same is true of the copyright notice. Now there's the new line thing as well. Our string test method actually by default truncates white space on the right of both strings anyway, because usually that's not significant, though you can certainly change that explicitly if you want to. So what might be ideal is, rather than just updating the test result, which we'd have to do every time we change those things, it would be great if we could tell the software, the reference testing software, that actually you should ignore lines that contain particular patterns, and you can do that various ways. The simplest one is just specify substrings that identify lines that you don't want to include in the comparison. So I'm going to say lines that have either version in title case or copyright in title case. If they differ between the two files, don't let that cause the test to fail. And if I do that and then run pytest again, the test now passes. And what's significant about that is that means we've now really upgraded the test so that we can have variation in the output that we have reason doesn't matter. And so that'll save us a lot of time. So that's all I really wanted to do today. We've seen, the squirreling away of results. We've seen the nice diff commands that you get access to and that it primes you with, and this ability to allow variation in the output. I should very briefly show you what conf test looks like, but basically you just always have the same thing. It just makes this ref available. It adds a couple of command line options as well and gives you the ability to specify where reference files are, which we haven't used in this case. So thanks a lot.